We're going to go ahead and begin. If you want a cookie or a cup of coffee, better get it now because we're going to dive into this. I am standing in for Jonathan Karl. Pull out all of your programs for today, take a pen, mark through the word Jonathan, and write Rove, R-O-V-E, after the remaining last name. I'm playing the role of Al Haig. I am in command here. I will be asking the questions. I want short answers. Not everybody, as Chris Wallace says, gets to answer every question. We got a lot of material to cover, so let's get started. First of all, at your far right, she said to me, "Why am I stuck on the left?" And I'm thinking, you're a Washington Post reporter. On your far right, but my far left, is my pal, Karen Tumulty, a graduate of the Crockett High School Cougars in Austin, Texas. University of Texas at Austin, journalism degree, and you may not know this, Harvard MBA. Longtime reporter with the Los Angeles Times, and then for decades with Time Magazine. She moved over in 2010 to the Washington Post where she was a reporter. Now she's got her own column. It's well worth reading. Get online and sign up for it. What you may not know about it is that they're rumors. I can confirm that they're accurate, that she and Admiral Bill McRaven were said to have a very close and deeply personal relationship in the 5th grade. Her husband is here, Paul Richter, longtime LA Times reporter who's written a sparkling new book that you need to go out and buy for Christmas called The Ambassadors. I'm saying this because I received a free copy from his editor at Simon & Schuster. And then Paul sent President Andrew Jackson to have a little conversation with me. So go out and buy it for Christmas. Sitting next to Karen is Lisa Lair of the New York Times. How many of you subscribe to the On Politics morning bulletin from the New York Times? By the end of this, every one of you will go up to Lisa. In fact, let's get it out of the way now. Lisa, how can people sign up for this indispensable daily newsletter on politics from the New York Times, written by a sharp, insightful, prolific reporter, namely you? How do they sign up?
You should go to, will you be my hype man for all, can I just
come on,
bring
move
you
on.
with
We'll
me?
move on. I've given you instructions.
nytimes.com/onpolitics.
There we go. Go to the New York Times website, sign up. Really good. Next to her is Jason Johnson. I met Mr. Johnson in the 1999 Todd Staples for State Senate campaign. He was just a youngster starting out, but he's gone great things since then. He ran Greg Abbott's first race for Attorney General and became his chief of staff, and by 2016 was the chief strategist for the Ted Cruz for President campaign, the only Republican candidate to actually beat Trump on a sustained basis, and the candidate who stayed in the longest until he ran into Indiana and got crushed. I want to say this about Jason. There are things that we could talk about today. I, for example, is mystified, by the tweet of July 26, 2013, in which he said, "Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul support hashtag defend Obamacare." That was the effort to shut down the government to repeal Obamacare. Quote, "Mitch McConnell, Karl Rove, and Barack Obama oppose. Clearer now," end quote. I'm not certain I get the import of this tweet, but maybe you could discuss that in the context of your grand strategy to get 60 votes in the Senate to vote for cloture for the repeal of Obamacare. Anyway, we'll come back to that later. Finally, John Asleone, who my best information about him was stolen by his mentor, James Carville, who claims to be responsible for the creation of this guy. You may not have heard his names, but for 25 years, he has been at the top of the Democratic polling business. Any Republican on the other side who sees that his firm has been hired has one response: oh shit. Yep. He has got an impressive number of wins, been involved in 2 presidential campaigns, one of them successful, Obama, one not so successful, Hillary Clinton. Anyway, this is our panel, and we're going to start here. We're going to start with Karen, and I want a response from everybody on this, but make it crisp and sharp. I'm starting with Karen, so you got time to get prepared. In your farewell column on Kamala Harris, which I thought was really good, every losing candidate in the Democratic presidential primary should get a farewell column, but that would chew up about half of the year's worth of columns for everybody. But you wrote a very interesting, I thought, column on it, and you said she failed because she lacked a theory of the case, which I thought was a great phrase. In fall of 2011, Barack Obama's approval rating was 43%. And yet he won a decisive victory a year later because he had a theory of the case. So let's start the entire panel off by talking, each one of you, what is the Trump path to victory? What is the theory of his case for a winning campaign in 2020? And we'll start with you, Karen.
I think he runs on the economy. Well, I think his campaign runs on the economy. The president will run however he feels like he wants to run at any given moment. But I think people need to understand the Trump campaign of 2020 is not going to be the Trump campaign of 2016. 2016, he was living off the land. And, until he practically had the nomination, his campaign consisted of about 5 people. He spent very little of his own money. He spent very little money compared to what he was doing. He lived off the RNC ground game. This time around, they have real money coming in. They have a real digital strategy, and I think they have a real ground game. And I think they're gonna push the economy as like, don't mess it up, America.
Lisa?
So I agree overall. I just question whether the president can effectively stay on that economic message because we've seen very little evidence of that. I think he keeps his base motivated. We've seen that with impeachment, that has been a rallying cry for Republicans. He does that. He gets those guys to turn out. Perhaps Democrats either have a process that goes well into the spring, allowing the Trump campaign, if they're effective, to sort of define the Democratic nominee. And they will define that person as, depending who it is, potentially as too far to the left or ineffective. And then I think the economy needs to hold for him. Whether he can push that message or not, that seems like an essential part of his appeal.
Jason?
Yes, sir. I agree completely with regard to the economy. Both, it should be front and center, and it may not be always because of the messenger. And I think importantly, he will continue, and he'll use impeachment and everything else, continue the them versus me, which is them versus you. Why are they fighting me so hard? It's because they do not respect the change that we wanted to bring to this town to drain the swamp. And so he will continue to basically unite by dividing.
John?
I think his theory of the case is fear, destruction, rape, and pillage. And I don't say that kiddingly. I just think that that's exactly how he'll run his campaign, is how he ran it last time. He's not going to change his colors. He doesn't change his colors on a day-to-day basis, so why should we think that he's going to treat it any differently? I think that his entire theory of the case, given that his job approval rating is in the low to mid 40s. With this economy, it should be in the mid to high 50s, but it's not. And so I think that his entire theory of the case is to destroy his Democratic opponent. I will say one thing. People do forget at the very end of the 2016 campaign that Donald Trump actually had some of the best ads he ever had, but just the last 2 weeks on the economy, they were like Ford F-150 commercials. And so I think that he has the ability to go there, and they may do it earlier or they may lace it all through it, but at the end of the day, it's going to be about tearing down Democratic nominee.
Yeah. Look, wasn't that, though, a big part of the winning strategy for Barack Obama in 2012? Make Mitt Romney look like a troglodyte, a wealthy Gilded Age figure who had no connection with the common man?
The difference is that we lucked out, right? I mean, we literally got a video in this social era of someone who was at his own fundraiser taking that video and leaking it. And so Barack Obama's theory of the case wasn't let's take this guy down. It was something that was quite frankly handed to us, and as like Democrats do, we nicely attack them on it.
Yeah, well, it did involve a sort of a certain amount of distortion of his record at Maine, for example. But my point is not to make a partisan one, but isn't part of every president's reelection campaign partly to say, I'm better than that person over there, that person's got a fundamental problem, and also to say, I got a second act in me.
Yes, and it's the theory of the case for, quite frankly, every state senate race, every congressional race, legislative race, et cetera. You're gonna make a contrast.
Yeah. Several of you have mentioned the economy. If you take a look at all the economic forecasting models, most notably Ray Fair at Yale, they all forecast an easy victory for Donald J. Trump. Yet his approval rating on the economy is 17 points better than his personal approval rating. So is this going to be the normal election that we've had before? If James Carville, it's the economy stupid, or James A. Baker III, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. Is there something fundamentally different about the nature of the relationship between the economy and the vote decision in this election?
I mean, his approval rate, he is running with historically low average public approval ratings. Donald Trump's approval has not gone up and down like normal presidents do. It stays in this kind of narrow band, and it seems to be sort of more than most presidents kind of divorced from the performance of the economy. And I do think it's his character, it's the way he behaves, it's the way he steps on his own message. I mean, it's just who he is.
Yeah, I'm not sure that this will be a race that's decided on the economy. I mean, regardless of what side of the political aisle you're on, Donald Trump is seen as someone who is divisive, right? And has an ability to turn all kinds of, introduce heated politics into all kinds of institutions, right? The NFL, I don't know, Broadway and Hamilton, remember from the beginning of his term. So my sense is that from talking to people out there, that they are voting on far more sort of cultural kinds of issues, which weren't, maybe sort of new cultural issues, but Donald Trump has ignited these flashpoints in American life, race, gender. He has an uncanny ability to do that. And so it's hard to see the election not being in large part on those flashpoints. And in that regard, it's not clear. There hasn't been, we were talking at my table at lunch, there hasn't been a ton of movement. For most people, where you are in 2017 is where you are now, although I suspect these guys may dispute that because movement at the margins, right, makes a big difference in presidential elections, of course. But I think what that speaks to is just how divisive he has always been and how that's factoring into people's votes.
John or Jason, any different?
Yeah, I do think a little different. I think that this will be fundamentally different for this reason. Most of these presidential campaigns are driven on an issue. It's the economy, stupid, we heard that before, or identity politics, which we thought was 2016. I think there's a different variable that we have not seen. Maybe we saw it after Nixon with Carter, which is there's a psychological element of normalcy. We're exhausted. I think the voting electorate is exhausted. They want their life back. There is just anxiety out there about this guy. And so I think there's going to be a universe of voter who like his agenda, who even likes that he really messes with Washington and the news media to shake things up, but just want to be able to refriend their high school buddy on Facebook, who they can't. And I really believe that there is a psychological variable that will fundamentally make this race different because we just want our lives back, and there's just so much exhaustion.
Yeah, Michael Bennett has this wonderful line that I think every Democrat should be using, which is if you elect me president, you will be able to go 3 and 4 days at a time without even thinking about who the president is.
Jason,
I would just first of all agree completely with John on the dynamic, right? I see it all the time, and we were talking about I don't live in D.C., he doesn't live in D.C., and we get to talk to everyday people. The fatigue factor is real. However, I think there are many things that Donald Trump is very talented at, but in my opinion, at the top of the list is taking any mistake or any weakness of his opponents and just turning it into, if you stub your toe, he'll convince the voters you need your foot amputated and then turn around and brand you as a cripple. Yeah. And so with regard to this fatigue, right, what is the cost of the fatigue? People are tired of it, right? But when he brands whoever the nominee is from the Democrat Party, people are going to stop and say, yeah, but how radical or out of touch, how is that going to change my life? Yeah, and so far, I'd say it looks good for him.
You mentioned the Democrats. Let's talk about the Democrats. What's the theory of their case? What does the winning Democrat campaign have to look like next year? Obama's was in 2012, and admittedly it was an incumbent running against a challenger, not a challenger running against an incumbent, but his was, Mitt Romney is unqualified to be president. He doesn't share your values. I've done a reasonably good job on things you care about, and I have a second act that he began to introduce in the summer of 2012 with the DACA decision, something that he previously said he couldn't do, but necessary because of flagging support in the Latino community and the need to show I've got a second act in me, he did it. What's the Democratic theory of the case next year?
Well, the other phrase that Obama used a lot in 2012 was break the fever. It didn't turn out to be true, but the idea was that if he could get reelected, this kind of partisanship that has, so divided the country would finally, the country would get past it. And I do think that, the Democrats are going to have their arguments during the primary over health care and over the new Green Deal and all these other things. But ultimately, I think, John, you're right. I mean, I think the theory of the case should be, let's get back to normal.
Anybody
Except
else?
I think there's a debate within the party over whether that's what Democrats want. I mean, I know which side of that debate you're on,
right,
but there are certainly many Democratic primary voters when you're out there who say there is no going back to normal, and what's necessary is sort of the more Warren-Bernie path of, as Elizabeth Warren calls it, big structural change. So I think that debate and where the party goes is being sussed out in the primary right now, and we're going to see how it ends up. The other thing I'll say is that talking to these early state Democratic primary voters is like talking to, everyone is a pundit now, and they should all have cable news contracts. They're all arguing out, well, I really kind of like this person, but what about this guy in a diner in Pennsylvania? And you say, have you ever met a person in a diner in Pennsylvania? And they say no. So it's kind of, they're obsessed with electability and who can win and trying to suss it out when really, I mean, it's very hard to do that do that successfully. So, but I think that's a huge dynamic in that race, this electability factor.
I want to keep going on this. What is the Democratic case? But since you made reference to it, I thought you did a really good piece about Obama, and Obama being overheard at a fundraiser, worried about the Democratic field veering left. He said, quote, "The country is less revolutionary than it is interested in improvement." And so he was suggesting that the Democrats like Warren and Sanders, who have this robust, bold, transformational agenda, we're going to transform America into something new, versus incremental reform. Sort of the Warren-Sanders on the one side, Biden and Buttigieg on the other, is the dynamic that's driving the Democratic the Democratic primary process. If that's true, how do you square the circle regardless of who comes out of that? Is that something that's going to end in July in Milwaukee? Or, I'm sorry he's gone. I was with James earlier a couple weeks ago, and his theory is that if the left doesn't win, their attitude is like he said, like the German communists in the 1930s, after Hitler us. So let it get as bad as it possibly can, and we could see a repeat of 2016 in which 1 out of every 12 Sanders supporters supports Trump's election. I mean, where's this all going inside the Democrats?
I think that the Democrats I talk to on a daily basis, whether it's in polling or focus groups, et cetera, they're not the activists, right? I mean, this is not an AOC convention. I mean, a majority of Democrats are either moderate or conservative. A majority of Democrats are over the age of 50. A majority of Democrats want someone who, quite frankly, 2/3 who can beat Trump over someone that they believe in. There's so much at stake, and Democrats know that there's so much at stake. And as Lisa was saying, every Iowa caucus goer, every New Hampshire voter is Jake Tapper and Rachel Maddow. I mean, really, this is how they talk.
Crazy.
And they will say things like Bernie Sanders voters stayed home in Pennsylvania. And so I really believe that there's so much at stake that they were going to come out and vote. But maybe more importantly, which is another fundamental change possibly, is the number of people who are going to come out, that the people who do sit on their hands will be just overwhelmed. And we won't have Jill Stein, hopefully, right? We won't have the third party sucking a universe off. And so I think that just the engagement level and the intensity level of what is at stake will override any major group of people sitting on their hands.
And it was so striking, if I can say one thing about that Obama piece, is so I wrote this piece. The weekend was Twitter, people on the left in Twitter just trashing President Obama, and they were very worked up. And then, a day later, I checked my inbox, and I was flooded with messages from people who said, no, President Obama's got it right. So I think some of the loudest voices, maybe, especially online, maybe those more liberal activists, but the bulk of the party, I suspect the data shows, is where you think it is. And there'll also be, everyone seems to expect this historic turn.
If the polls are that we want to win, why is it that in the national polls, Bernie and Elizabeth poll in the high 30s or low 40s combined? I mean, Sanders got 46% of the primary vote in 2016, based on whether you include the caucuses or not. So if it really is, we're going to pick the person who is best able to win. I understand why that says Joe Biden. I understand that why that says Pete Buttigieg has a boost. But why does it say the durability of 40% of the Democratic primary saying we want to go for Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders?
But that leaves 60% who are, not with them.
Well,
I think that's
or up
important.
for grabs. I mean, you got 10 or 15% who are for everybody from Booker to Harris to Yang to Williamson to et cetera, and then a small group of people and the amazing thing to me is primaries typically presidential primaries tend to have weakly anchored people at this point, and yet they've been sort of the two most durable facets of this have been Biden has sort of been here, and the two of them have had a combined score sort of here.
But isn't part of it that people haven't started voting yet? And once we see who can actually do well in Iowa, one thing people haven't picked up on is that, yes, California has moved its primary early, but early voting in California begins the day of the Iowa caucuses. And so, I do think that if somebody breaks out in Iowa or if somebody breaks out in New Hampshire, people are suddenly going to, A, have heard of them, and number two, start to believe that maybe they are viable. And by Super Tuesday, and John, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but won't like a third of the United States population be voting on Super Tuesday?
Right.
Which is 1 month after Iowa.
I also think in an election where everyone is obsessed with who can win, what makes you look like someone who can win? Actually winning something, right? So the impact, we're sort of gaming this all out, and it's all, people have to actually start voting.
Yeah. Let me ask you though. First of all, we're straying away from what I hear about the theory of the case for Democrats is we hate Trump and we're going to turn out in record numbers to defeat the son of a bitch.
No. I can give you more if you want.
Well, hold on. I want to stay where we are. I've noticed it's sort of a 3-to-1 panel here, so Jason, keep jumping in. But this issue of the most electable. Don't we sometimes have people who we think are the most electable because they do agree with us or we agree with them? And second of all, what happens if we do have 3 or 4 candidates in Iowa who are above 15%, the 15% threshold? There's a piece last week in the Wall Street Journal on this. It was, I thought, very insightful, well done, sharp, crisp. I think I did a hell of a job with it myself. And if you take the current numbers that these people have in Iowa and assume that they're all above 15% and assume that they're roughly there on election day, the difference between the number 1 and number 3 and number 4 is the difference between 13 delegates and 9 delegates, with the others at 11 and 10. Is it really going to be such that if somebody gets 13 delegates as opposed to somebody's 11 delegates, that this is going to drive people in California and Texas to say, we got to go for the person who got 13 as opposed to 11 or 10 or 9?
Well,
Maybe not.
I mean, listen, I think that as pundits or people in this business, we like to always go back to previous cycles, not really believing that this could be completely different than any cycle that we've ever been in. And it really could be. And the fact is that what might happen is it's not about who wins, but it's about the margins. And if they're all bunched together, all of a sudden, it's a completely different game. And Iowa and New Hampshire are just Iowa and New Hampshire from a different era, and they're not really game changers. And you have a place like Nevada, which really becomes kind of like the battleground state, because it becomes the first real state to see if there can be any differentiation. And that really might be where we are. Yeah. But no one wants to believe it because Iowa, decides who's the president. And guess what? Might not this time.
Well, and it normally doesn't. I mean, I think that was one of the great points from the previous panel. New Hampshire has a desire to say, screw what Iowa did, we're going to do something differently. And South Carolina says, we're the adult in the room. And now we have Nevada before the adult, and it's going to play a bigger role in it.
I'm going to just add on this potential that you're talking about. First of all, if everyone's bunched together, like was pointed out in that amazing, brilliant column in the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you.
In addition to that, if we look historically, I mean, one of the reasons that the early states have had such an impact is because they allow the winner to dominate and shape the earned media coverage coming out of it, right? And there's just no amount of money that can replace that. One, on the substance, if you have candidates that are truly bunched, it's going to be more difficult to do that. But again, I'll go back to Trump and his ability to disrupt the media narrative. This is something I've thought about for a long time since this cycle has begun. Has anyone done a study yet to look at the coverage? I know I've seen the different rankings of share of coverage, but in total for a primary cycle, I bet you that the overall coverage from the networks, from the cable news channels has not been as high of the actual one-party process as it has been in the past because Trump dominates everything.
As long as we're stuck in the primaries, one last question before we turn our attention back to the general election. Michael Bloomberg, factor, no factor, unknown factor? Anybody?
Well, his premise is, I think, that Biden doesn't do well in those first 4 states, that he limps into Super Tuesday, out of money, out of momentum, and, Bloomberg's already spending money in all 50 states.
Yeah.
Right.
As you put it, I thought in a great column, he is planning on a path to the nomination that is narrow and non-traditional and predicated on a Biden collapse, which I think is absolutely true. But the question is he likely to succeed?
I mean, look, your instinct on this, I think, would be to say, no, you can't get in the primary late, and this is a bad strategy, and everyone knows it's a bad strategy, but we could be in unprecedented times, as you point out. He's spending an unprecedented amount of money. So it's really, I think it's just really hard to know. You could have, right, there's chatter now about a scenario where you have 4 different winners of the 4 early states, and then Bloomberg comes in. So I just think it's an unknown, which is not a satisfying answer.
But we may know sooner rather than later, because he has already spent, up to this point, more than everyone else has spent combined on TV.
$54 million as of 2 weeks ago.
And why I say that is because when you are and he's not communicating in the early 4 states. He's only communicating in the Super Tuesday states. So if you live in the state of Alabama like I do, you're seeing Bloomberg ads right now. And when you communicate in a vacuum and you then do a poll, you should see your numbers rise at least to 7, 8, 9, 10%. But here's the thing is, even in Super Tuesday states, he's got to get 15% in a threshold to get one single delegate. Yeah. So if you're in the 7th Congressional District, which is Birmingham, Alabama, you got to get 15% to get a delegate. And so if you think Michael Bloomberg, a liberal, well, I wouldn't say the former New York mayor, is going to do great in Alabama or Tennessee or North Carolina, and I can go on, the states, Oklahoma that day, more power to you. But we probably will know sooner than later.
Well, even in Oklahoma, the Democrats like their big gulps. So, but I think, and the other thing is that we had at this, and I'd like your reaction to this. We had a panelist this morning who's done some very good research. Is it Vavreck? Is she Dr. Vavreck here? Yeah, whose point is, dollars in advertising have a limited duration. They have a limited span of impact. So he can go out and spend $54 million now, but doesn't some of that get washed away by what happens during the month of coverage during which he's going to be absent from the screen except for paid advertising, namely the month of February? Okay, we've exhausted this one, obviously. All right, so impeachment. Any impact on the election for the White House, the Senate, the House?
Tee it up, Jason.
Say that again.
I said, tee it up, Jason.
Oh, come on, come on. That's your way to suckering him into it, Ezzaloni. Come on.
I'll bite. I think you certainly know, I think we all know the latest polling, in the swing districts. We've all seen that impeachment has become less popular, or support for impeachment and removal has become less popular as this whole thing's gone along. And I don't know how it necessarily impacts the House, though I suspect that several of those seats that Democrats took in 2018 will come back, and impeachment will be a big part of it. But overall, I think it's yet another thing that President Trump uses to play into that narrative to paint the Democrats into a corner of being extreme, not being rational, and just turns it into a strength. Now, whether or not it ultimately is one, I'll go with what Carville said earlier, and we don't know. Good dose of humility is a good thing. But I do think, all in all, he's using it, and he'll be able to use it to his advantage to say, they're just against me, they're against me because they're against you and the things I'm trying to do to drain the swamp. At the same time, it certainly can play into the whole fatigue factor that John brought up.
I think I was in a roundtable of reporters with Nancy Pelosi about a month ago. She's very pragmatic and realistic about this because, the numbers are actually a lot higher than they were in July when it was just the Mueller report that we were talking about. And they've basically edged up to the point where the country is just evenly divided. But in this roundtable, Nancy Pelosi said, this isn't going to be like Watergate. There is not going to be suddenly this big surge of support because there's a lot of new information. We're a different kind of country now. People are in their tribes. It's not going to move. I think if it was a purely political proposition for the House, the smart thing would have been to censure the guy and start talking about something else. But I do think the nature of what we're talking about in the Ukraine is just fundamentally different.
But if we are a divided country, doesn't that put at risk a number of the Democrats who are in those 31 seats that were won by Donald Trump, in which Democrats replaced a Republican member of Congress?
And if it had not been an op-ed in the Washington Post by some of those very freshman House members in those moderate districts who had national security backgrounds who said, we're now for impeachment, Pelosi wouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
Well, I would also say that, listen, I applaud Nancy Pelosi how she's handled this, the inquiry, and there's certainly going to be a vote. I think it's the right thing. It's going to go to a Senate. But I don't think there's anyone out there, whether you're a consultant or whether you're a congressperson, who can't wait to start talking about health care, can't wait to start talking about, stagnated salaries, deteriorating education, fix the damn roads, whatever it may be. The fact is, we really want to get back to what worked in 2018. And I'm not saying that this is a complete impediment, but it's not a great message. Again, acknowledging that I think it's the right thing to do.
Lisa, you had a piece recently in which you talked about the Democratic Party facing the possibility of an all-white field of finalists for the presidential nomination. We've had Kamala Harris fall by the wayside. Julian Castro has not gotten liftoff. Cory Booker has sort of been erratic. Does this present a problem in the fall for the Democrats if they have a ticket that is all-white finalists, and particularly if it's all-white male finalists?
I don't think Democrats will have a ticket that's two white men. So you could speak to that better. I just don't think that will happen.
So they'll answer it. So if it's Biden, he's going to be picking Kamala or Stacey or somebody.
Yeah, or
Cory.
I don't know. I think that this desire for Democrats to oust President Trump is so much greater than any internal divide within the party. That will overrule any feelings, about diversity or representation or things like that. But I do think, in the short term, it's not a great look for Democrats, given how much they've leaned into this message that they are sort of the bastion of diversity in the Trump era. And then you're going to have this December debate where it's a all-white field, majority male. I think that sort of will fuel, and we see that it is already fueling the internal divides within the party. My instinct on this is that those divides, when it comes to the general election, will not be so problematic because the hatred of Trump just is so much greater than any of those sentiments. But in the short term, I just think it's not, I don't think it's quite where people in the Democratic Party would want them to be had they been able to sort of design the field. But it's because of their own debate criteria.
Anybody else on the question? All right, what groups are up for grabs in the 2020 election? What does each side need to, what groups in the electorate does each side need to be worried about?
I think I would keep my, I'd keep my eyes on white women. Because that's the group where, at least in our polling, you're seeing a lot of movement.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's suburban white women. They don't like the president's tone. They don't like the chaos, all the things that we've been talking about, but they may like some of what he accomplished in the economy. So they really fueled the Democrats' wins in the House in 2018. So where those white women go will be really crucial to watch.
Okay, Jason and John, you're advising Trump. What do you do to worry? What if you're worried about college-educated suburban white women? What do the two of you tell the president to do?
I took the last one first.
Well, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to say watch three groups in the
I'm going to come back
election.
to you. I'm going to come back to you.
All right.
Because you go ahead, though, to answer.
Oh.
Answer my question.
Oh,
goddammit.
answer your question. He's
then
in
we'll come back
charge.
and
I don't know if
then-
anyone knew this, but he's
Yeah.
in charge.
I did, and that's all
But
we worry about, my
here's the
friend.
problem. I mean, you can't give him any advice, right?
Well,
and so no. Here's
no,
my
that's
advice.
escaping the
Here's my
question.
advice for him. Once it's all of the Senate stuff is done and you're getting into a new year, is that he needs more accomplishments, right? He has the tax bill or the tax, which didn't really help him, and he needs something on health care, and he has the ability to do that. He has voiced it. He can be very populist when he wants to, right? And he has been very populist on health care, and he needs to have something to show. And I think that is a big problem for him.
Or accomplishments, particularly in healthcare. Jason?
Security, national security, and if possible, to talk about border security in a way that doesn't exacerbate the problem, then I would lump that in as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to your question, the thing you wanted to talk about.
Well, I think that I agree with Karen and Lisa about women, but I think specifically non-college educated white women, we've seen some deterioration with Trump's numbers, and you saw in 2018 a little bump up for Democrats, so I think that is a key group. I think that a group that you have to watch is younger black men. It was a huge problem for Hillary Clinton in places like Philadelphia, in places like Milwaukee, and in places like Detroit. We have, that I don't want to call it a problem, but it is, we haven't figured that out. And the third is rural America. Okay, James talked about it being 18% of the universe. The fact is Democrats just have to win. We have to lose by a little less. We just can't continue doing the 75-25. We need, I know this sounds strange, but the 70-30, right? The 32-68. I mean, we just need to lose by just a little bit less, and it will pay great dividends in a close election. Yeah. We can't not speak to rural America.
Yeah. Isn't it possible for the economy to help Trump incrementally improve his performance among groups like young black men? I mean, in 2000, Bush got 8% in the African American vote. In 2004, he got 13%, but in the battleground states, he got 16. And while that may sound small, getting 16% of 100, it nonetheless is a significant number when you apply it to the population. So between his 29% among Latinos and 8% among African Americans, is there a chance for Trump to marginally improve the numbers among those groups if he cares about doing it? One of the interesting things to me, and I think it was interesting to them, was, as you know, they're now taking all the data of anybody who applies for a ticket and comes into those rallies and immediately laying it against the voter file. And when they had their El Paso rally, they found out that 30% of the attendees at the rally were low-propensity Latino Democrats from New Mexico who are enjoying the prosperity of the Permian Basin in southeast New Mexico, Little Texas as it's called, and were enthusiastically responding to Trump's message as a result. Isn't there a chance, an opening for him if he's smart enough to take it?
Absolutely. And the one group I was going to mention were African Americans, and you mentioned specifically young African American men. And as you just pointed out, President Bush's numbers. I mean, 1, 2, 3% of the vote share and increase is huge. And on top of that, it's not just the share of the vote, but what is African American turnout, right? And how is that impacted by whoever the Democrats choose? But I think that's the biggest group to pay attention to. And the campaign, I'm not familiar with anything other than what I see on the news, but they certainly are making an effort for black voter outreach around the country.
Let's talk a minute about one of the groups that John talked about, rural America. Is Trump in trouble with trade policy because it's keeping soybean farmers in North Dakota and cattlemen in Missouri and row crop agriculture and industrial Midwestern states from reaping the profits of foreign sales? Or are they willing to give them a little bit of a time to get it done?
My sense of that is more anecdotal than in the data, but just in talking to people, cotton farmers in Arizona, I'm finding that they're still pretty much sticking with Trump. I mean, I don't know how long their patience lasts in this, but it's kind of, well, he knows what he's doing. But I don't know if that's durable.
Yeah, I'm finding the same thing anecdotally, that they're still willing to stick with him. And, it is around this cultural identification issue as well, I think.
We have any comments?
No, I would just say I agree. I agree with you, and it's somewhat disappointing, right? I mean, they did get subsidies. It didn't fill the hole in their bank account. But again, what's a bigger issue in rural America? Make sure that their hospital didn't shut down, right? I mean, so we have ways to go in there and talk about economic development and talk about different things that we can do to bolster these small communities. For Democrats, it's just showing up. It's just showing that you give a damn about small town America. And I think that's important. We're just saying, again, just like you were talking about, all he has to, Trump trying to steal another 3 or 4 points away from African Americans or Latinos. We're just trying to steal away 3, 4, 5 points away from rural America because it adds up.
Well, let me give you an early indicator that said to me Democrats have got a continuing problem with this. First place I picked up opposition to Medicare for All was I spoke at 2 different state association of hospitals. And the rural hospital guys sought me out and said, do you understand what Medicare for All will do by lowering reimbursements? In our part of it, we will shut down. Here's how many hospitals we'll lose in Indiana. Here's how many we'll lose in another state. They were very pointed about it, and this was.
They loved Medicaid expansion.
They loved Medicaid expansion, but Medicare for All and the abolition of private health insurance and making everybody get paid. They were like, we're going to be shut down, and rural America is going to be cut off. And this was months. This was at least weeks, if not months, before the general buzz got going about it. They were, and the problem for Democrats is all those rural health administrators, they go to the Rotary Club on Wednesday, and they're at the Garden Club, and they go to the First Baptist Church of Coweta, and everybody, they talk about this. What states? I love this thing. We have this theory that there's little change in battleground states, or at least we think that, but in reality, I mean, Texas was a battleground state in 1980, one of the 10 battleground states. In 2000, battleground states were included Arkansas, Tennessee, as Shaw can tell you, Kentucky, and West Virginia. So what are the battleground states likely to be this time? Obviously the president's going to be playing defense in the big blue states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but where else are we going to be seeing a concentration of activity?
Well, those 3 are going to be everybody's obsession, but I do think places like maybe Arizona might be worth watching. The other thing we haven't talked about is there's Senate races going on all over the country, and I think that's going to have an effect.
Yeah, I'm also interested in Arizona in part because how that state seems to be changing, but also because the voter composition here and about a third of the electorate, of course, is independent. So it's beyond those big 3, which we're going to be all moving into, I think, for the next year. So Arizona's where I'll be keeping an eye.
And it's hard to can you guys think of any state that Trump is actually likely to win in 2020 that he didn't win in 2016?
Well, he's
That was
gonna-
my question to you.
I mean, I think he's going to listen. I think he believes Minnesota.
Yeah, he does.
Because it's lily white and it's like Wisconsin. The other state that I would throw on the pile there for Democrats is Georgia. Because Georgia, if you just look at how it naturally has fallen with no paid communication in 8, 12, and 16, has been one of the closer states just naturally to happen. And I think that what we have not had in Georgia has now been created by Stacey Abrams. We now have an infrastructure where she registered and got almost Obama-level African Americans out. And I think that will be potentially an important state as well. And the thing about Arizona and Georgia, they have one dominant media market. So you have Atlanta and you have Phoenix, and it's incredibly efficient. And Texas, unfortunately, isn't.
So, New Hampshire? We heard that, we heard that a little bit from the previous panel, but I'm hearing a lot from the Trump people that having lost by 1,500 votes, they think they can get it this time around, as well as potentially Maine. They took Maine too last time around, and the registration numbers there have gotten much better for them, and they think they can take Maine. Okay, a lot of skepticism in this crowd.
I'm somewhat of a believer in New Hampshire.
Well, I hope he plays in Maine, because I think if he plays in Maine, it will absolutely kill Susan Collins. Mm-hmm. I think no, seriously. I mean, I think if he is communicating,
You are one hard guy, man.
No, I believe it. I think Susan Collins is on the ropes as it is, and I think that she's maybe in the toughest position of any U.S.
You don't think
Republican
it's good for
senator.
the country to have an independent Republican representing at least some part of the country?
Angus King is really that.
Yeah, okay. Well, Cox was a Democrat, so I'm not certain he's counted as a Republican.
I meant
All right, let's talk about money. We touched on this earlier a little bit. The Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign have together in this cycle so far raised $250 million and have a bunch of it in the bank. And the total, by my calculation, the total number of money raised by the Democrats, not including Bloomberg's bazillions, is $198 million, and they've spent a lot of that. Is money going to be a critical advantage for either side in 2020, or a critical element for either side in 2020, or is there going to be plenty of money for everybody?
I think right now it's primarily a gauge of enthusiasm, and certainly a great sign for Republicans and the president. But at the end of the day, I think there definitely will be plenty of money for everyone.
Yeah, I think so too. I think those Democratic numbers, I mean, there are a number of Democrats who are not giving, right? They're kind of waiting to see how this shakes out still. And I just think once there's a nominee, the money will flow.
Okay. All right, so we're getting to the end. I want to ask one final question. Everybody in this panel has either been involved in presidential campaigns or has reported and observed presidential campaigns and remembers the surprise moments or the unforced errors that cause something dramatic to happen in the campaign. So I want each one of you to give me your forecast of this is the second to last question, of what kind of unforeseen thing, event, error, action might cause the election to move one way or the other. Karen?
Oh, gosh. Unforeseen things, they tend to happen in Iowa, and they tend to happen like within 3 weeks of the caucuses. I do think that everybody, sort of every time Biden goes out in public, everybody kind of holds their breath. So, it could be he does something that really connects with people, or he does something that a stumble that is like one too many.
I don't know. I think I'm having trouble even imagining what an unforeseen moment could be that would like really move things, because I think our gauge of gaffes and these moments have just shifted so dramatically during Trump's presidency. So I sort of feel like it would, I honestly can't remember what happened last Monday, and like 100 things have happened since then. So it's hard for me to think of one like gaffe or whatever that could do it. But I think it would have to be something really big, like an economic collapse or a war or something huge, right? But I'm curious what you guys...
The fact that Bernie Sanders could have a heart attack.
Yeah, he had a heart attack. That was the thing that happened, and it seems fine. Right.
Jason?
Yeah, my thought was exactly where you headed there. I think it's more likely for a number of reasons, including just how compact the media cycles are, that it's an external event.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's going to be completely an internal event while we all celebrate the holidays. Iowans are going to go from they're lusting for, the next candidate to love while we sleep, and they're going to move internally like they always have to the candidate that they think can beat the Republican nominee. Literally in December of 2003, Kerry was at 9%. But here's the really amazing thing. Edwards was at 4%. You know how this played out? Kerry gets 38, Edwards gets 34. We always forget about Edwards because we always talk about Kerry. But the fact is, that was the amount of shifting away from not only Dean, but Gephardt, right? And it's just this is about to happen. Only in America can we be here on December 9th, and it's still really too early for Iowa to really start formulating. And that's what's going to happen over the next 50 days.
On this question, I'm with Lisa and Jason that it's likely to have to be a big external event like a recession or a threat of war or a big foreign policy mistake to have an impact on the election.
Or pragmatism, and that's my point.
Yeah. With John's observation about Iowa, I have to remember my theory about Iowa is that once they do fall in love with you, they stay with you. In New Hampshire, they're fickle as all get out. We would go up there in 1999 and 2000. This guy would show up at all the events. He'd say, "George, I love your mother and father. I'm going to be for you." Next time we go there, he'd say, George, I went and heard John McCain do a town hall meeting, and he did a terrific job, and so I hate to tell you, but I'm for him. And then we come back and say, George, I've been thinking about it. You're a successful governor of a big state. You got the experience to be the chief executive. I'm for you. And the last time we showed up in the state, about the 8th time the guy would show up at an event, he said, George, I've decided firmly I'm going to be for you. I'm casting my ballot for you. And we lost by 19 points. I wish that son of a bitch had come up and said, I'm for McCain, and I know what the outcome would have been. So, outcomes. Lightning round. Who's going to be the Democratic nominee, and who's going to win the general election? John, we're going to you first.
All right. Biden.
Biden. Oh. Jason.
Biden, Trump.
Oh,
Lisa.
Man. I pass.
I know.
pass.
I'm out of the prediction game.
Of the prediction
Look.
business.
You can bet against the field. So it's like, I'm picking this person, but I'm not saying they got a better than 50-50 chance of winning for the Democratic nominee. Come on.
I just won't do that. I just won't. I was.
Paul told me you were like this, so you weren't going to be any fun at all. Lisa?
Oh, I'm out of that
Be
game.
a good sport.
After last time, I am out
You
of
work
that.
for the goddamn New York Times. You opine all the time. Opine on this
We're not
one.
predictive. We're covering the moments as they happen.
Okay. How many say Biden, Democratic nominee? How many say Warren? How many say Sanders? How many say Mayor Pete? How many say the little mayor from New York? How many say somebody else? Okay, general election. How many say the Democrat? How many say Trump? We're a narrowly divided country and a narrowly divided audience. Thank you for coming.
Good to meet you.
Do that.
Let me know when